Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I'll start with you, Dr. Gupta. You were clear in your comments that you don't think it's reasonable to deny people with only a mental illness access to MAID if it's permitted for people with a physical condition. Do you believe that all mental health diagnoses could lead to someone being eligible for MAID?
Thanks so much for the question. Mr. Chair, it's an excellent question, and I think the Canadian legislation is quite clear.
If I may reclaim my time, it was a yes or no question, Doctor.
I would allow her briefly, Dr. Gupta, to finish your response.
The legislation is clear that it's trying to capture people in certain kinds of clinical circumstances rather than point to specific diagnoses. So I would say that what's important is the circumstances of the person, not the medical category we classify them with.
But just for clarity, do you believe that there are certain diagnoses that could never rise to that level of being grievous and irremediable and justify medical assistance in dying as far as diagnostic mental illnesses are concerned?
Well, there are, Mr. Chair, there are certainly diagnoses that by definition are intended to be time limited or reactive to certain kinds of circumstances. And I think we can safely assume that those would not meet the legislated criteria as they are currently written.
Do you believe an eating disorder could qualify someone for MAID?
Again, I think the legislation is clear that it really depends on the circumstances of the person.
So it could?
Potentially.
Okay. And depression as well, major depressive disorder?
Again, it depends on the clinical circumstances of the person.
Is there consensus among psychiatrists on how many treatments one needs to try or for how long one needs to seek treatment for it to be classed as treatment resistant?
The use of the term treatment resistance in the clinical research literature is meant to capture different populations depending on the goal of the study being undertaken. So there are a range of different definitions, but of course, as we know, treatment resistant is not the term that's used in the legislation. It is a different term that describes a different set of circumstances than what researchers are interested in when they want to identify a population they consider treatment resistant.
Would it be reasonable to expect someone in a situation like this where they have a diagnosis of a mental illness to try all available treatments before qualifying for MAID?
Well, again, I think it is difficult to make rules about diagnosis. I think we have to look at the individual person. Certainly, ordinary clinical practice would be that you would pursue all of the usual standard accepted treatments for a condition and then some. Propose experimental treatments, innovative treatments, etc. But there may be reasons that an individual has that they can't take advantage of those treatments. They may not tolerate them. They may not be available. Really, it may be so experimental it's only available in one center in the country. It may not really be considered safe for that person in light of their other health circumstances. So I think there is some variable there. But if what you're suggesting is, the standard suite of recommended treatments, that's what people ideally would have, absolutely.
But choice, shock therapy, I know, is something that someone may find to be very helpful for them. Someone else may be put off by it. Would you ever suggest that a patient has to try that if there is a legitimate justification to use that therapy for their condition? Or would you say that a patient has a choice to say, no, I don't want that treatment, even though it's available, I'd rather go through the MAID process?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, people always have a choice if they are capable to refuse a recommended treatment. That is the state of consent and capacity law in this country. But that doesn't make the person automatically eligible for MAID, if that's what you're getting at.
But would it make them ineligible for MAID if they did not want to try a treatment that a psychiatrist thought could help them?
Yeah, so again, I think we're in the hypothetical here. I think if in the context of a clinical conversation about treatment, it was clear that ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, was an appropriate treatment for that person's condition. They hadn't tried it, and there was no reason not to go forward. And the person was saying, look, under no circumstances will I have it, insist on having MAID. I think it would be fair for the assessor to say, I can't find you eligible in this circumstance, but perhaps at a later time we can talk about this again. On the other hand, if there was a good reason not to go forward with ECT, there was some risks in terms of the person's health, or just to take a kind of hypothetical scenario, someone who is a lifelong activist against ECT, would it be reasonable to force that person to do something that they, for moral or other reasons we're just in disagreement with? That might be a situation where you would say, no, it's not reasonable to try to force that person to undertake that. So I think there's a lot of individual variation.
We've each
Thank
done a
you.
hypothetical now. Thank you.